Hi, Peter. Very nice to meet you, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. Do you mind if I record the interview? Of course, it's running now. We're going to use it on social media. So,
no, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, excellent. For anyone who's new to this, Earth.org is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies, for the protection of the natural environment, and an extension of governance or oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org talks and interviews like these, we try to engage with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience, also to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. So thank you very much. For our audience, I'd like to welcome Peter Fiekowsky. Peter is an MIT-educated physicist and engineer, a serial entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a social innovator. He's worked at NASA, at the Fairchild-Schlumberger Artificial Intelligence Lab at Palo Alto, and taught at MIT. He's developed his own machine vision company, which is automated visual inspection. And he's also author of the book Climate Restoration, which is published in April 22, which is why we're here today to talk about the book. In your book, you make a strong case that the Paris goals are a mirage, and the real goals should be restoring the Earth's atmosphere to something close to pre-industrial levels.
Yes, it's sort of simple that everyone wants to restore a climate that humans have actually survived long term. And we collectively settled on the Paris goals because, well, we were told to. And so if primarily for economic reasons. And the thesis of the whole book is that we all want the same thing. There's no objection that we also want to restore a sustainable population. And we can do all of that with existing methods, technology, and finance. And the only thing missing at this point is the collective will to get it done. And we can do. That's what the book is for, and that's what this interview is for.
Yeah,
and that's what your audience is for. Audience.
Absolutely, it's about gathering that political will and activating that political will. I think in many cases against, as you said, structural political shortcomings essentially in some of the systems that were designed. We can
and we're not likely to change those in the time we have. I'm a firm believer in play the cards you're dealt and turn them over and look at them and then play them, rather than wishing they were some other card. So we've got this political system, this economic system, this social system. We'll play those cards. I'm finding it a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, I mean, just as a bit of an opener, which I try to ask everyone is, what do you think are the greatest risks that face humanity today?
Well, climate change is the most immediate one. Associated with that is the methane burst from the Arctic, because that could happen in 10 years and it would likely be extinction level. And we have a solution to that. Then the cause of those is population, which is we have 10 times the population that the planet sustainably for 10,000 years. So there's a hint that there's a reason that the planet sustained at that level, not today's level. Those are the three, the climate, methane burst, and population.
Yeah, I think so. We'll talk a little bit more about population because I know it's one of the chapters of the book. But a sort of more general kind of question: do you think the human race is sleepwalking its way to a kind of hell on earth?
Yeah. And for ever since the beginning of time, ever since the beginning of humanity, the most important thing has been to belong to your group. So if that means believing in heaven and hell or believing in Zeus, that's what we did. Because if you're in a community that believes in heaven and hell and you don't, they'll throw you under the bus. That's just what humans do. And that's called sleepwalking, because it involves not thinking. It involves not questioning. And and so this climate restoration actually gets us out of that and says, okay, I believe that I'm here to take care of future generations. I happen to cross that myself and took that on that is the mission I have on my wall says, my mission is to leave a world that we're proud of for our children. And that's why I had to work on the climate, because if I didn't do that, I would be really embarrassed. So I took it on.
Yeah, I think, that's one very interesting, the intergenerational justice, I think is a very interesting topic, whether that's really a motivator, because I think when something is multi-generations ahead, that puts it sort of out of the reach of most people's contemplation. But I think when it's something our children will face, and I think that's certainly becoming clearer and clearer, that our children will grow up, especially in their mid of their lives or the later part of their lives, in a world which could be tremendously different in a bad way, and I think that brings it much closer to people's ability to process.
Yeah, it's a question of belonging, and so I accidentally attached myself to future generations. When I wrote that mission statement 20 years ago, I didn't know what I was doing. It just sounded really good. It sounded like something that I could spend my life doing, not knowing what it meant. And then I've discovered that it meant, rather than belonging to the economic system, right? Most of us belong to the economic system. I belong to the US, you belong to Hong Kong, except when Hong Kong kicks you out due to COVID and you're in Italy. Now you belong to Italy and Hong Kong. My point is, creating a belonging is pretty easy. You just move somewhere else, now you belong to that place too. And so I think all it takes is people to attach themselves to future generations and what they want. And that's really obvious. They want a CO2 of 280, which is what our civilization needs. They want nature. And in order to preserve nature, we need to have a population that for 10,000 years proved it was in balance with nature.
Yes, there's several sort of very slow moving ships, which I think are what, I think underlying the science is a few inevitable facts, which I think you've drawn attention to in the book, which is that the current level, even the current level without future emissions is also problematic. I mean, 400 or so is problematic for us in terms of sea level rise eventually, and potentially in terms of ocean acidification within a slower time frame. And those ships are very hard to turn around. So a stasis at 400 or a stasis at 450 is just not doable. I mean, this is one of the cruxes of your argument.
Yeah, well, we could definitely stabilize the planet at 450 or 400. The trouble is that there's no actual evidence that we would survive that. Now, Bill Gates's children and Michael Bloomberg's children are likely to survive that, but yours and mine, they might not. And that's not, playing Russian roulette with our children is simply socially unacceptable. And so, the UN goal of trying to stay below 2 degrees, where no one, or even 1.5 degrees, trying to get to a stable 1.5, where no one had, if you think about it, have you ever heard anyone say, oh yeah, we have a decent chance of survival if we stay at 1.5? I've talked to lots of UN people, they've never heard anyone make that claim.
Yeah.
What they say is, listen, that may be true, but listen, 1.5 is much better than 2 degrees warming. But I say, dead is dead. Doesn't matter whether it's dead at 1.5 or dead at 2.
Yeah, it seems strange that in the end, can you explain the history of why it ended up being a temperature goal rather than, let's say, a straight up CO2 level goal?
Yeah. To the best of my knowledge, for sure, the 2 degree goal came from William Nordhaus. In 1977, he since won a Nobel Prize in economics for this. He was challenged by the problem that it's going to cost money to switch over from fossil fuel to clean energy. And in an economy, you want to maximize GDP. And so how little can we do the switchover and still keep a growing GDP? And he looked at the data and he just threw a dart and said, it looks like 2 degrees warming is going to maximize GDP. And that was his calculation. Back in '77, we didn't know a lot about a lot of the ecosystems we know about now, and including the sea level rise. He had no idea what would happen with sea level rise and storms and wildfires and loss of coral. That wasn't included at all. And so that was the source of 2 degrees. And then around 2015 at the Paris talks, the activists, especially small island states, said, you know what, sea level is rising is terrible. Let's do better than 2. And someone said, oh, how about 1.5? And that was the science behind choosing 1.5, that it's better than 2, with no claim that it's survivable. And I chose a CO2 level because as an engineer and a scientist, I can only control things that I can measure and control. And so you can't even measure global temperature. You can estimate it, right? Because you have to have 10,000 sensors around the world, and they have to be calibrated correctly. And how do you calibrate a sensor on Mount Everest to work in tandem with a sensor in Honolulu? You can, but it's hard. And it's like, you and I don't want to be involved. In contrast, CO2 is measured on one peak in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, and everyone agrees. And we know that if you want to reduce the number on that by 1 part per million, you need to remove 8 billion tons of CO2. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And so it gives us a knob, like a thermostat in your house. The thermostat does temperature, because it knows that if you burn 1 cubic foot of natural gas, it'll raise the temperature in your house 5 degrees or something like that. Very simple control. CO2 gives us a very simple control over restoring the climate.
Yeah. And you touched on a couple of things there. The growth myth. The GDP being the wrong measure of success. That's a whole other topic, which perhaps we could talk about another time.
Well, it's that belonging thing that starting with Adam Smith, we chose to belong to the economy. It's just collectively. It's not like we even had a choice. Just like I didn't have a choice about being American. I was born here, and it's fine with me. We were born into a capitalist world thanks to metaphorically thanks to Adam Smith, because there were a lot of forces before and after him. But we were born into this capitalist world, and so we were born into a world of growth. Now, what's great is once you notice that you were born into it, you can choose. Before you realize that, oh, that happened to me, or not to me, but that happened and I was there, now you can actually choose. And so it's actually, in a way, much simpler than we tend to think, because we tend to think, oh, I have to have a revolution. And I like Bucky Fuller says, you never change the existing reality by fighting it. You change it by creating something new that supersedes it. And I apologize, I got the words wrong, but his is more poetic,
right?
But you can't fight the existing reality and expect to change. You have to build something new. In this case, it's creating an identity with future generations. Well, that can be in tandem with capitalism. Because all you do then is, now capitalism is for the benefit of future generations, and then you guide it appropriately.
Yeah, certainly the guidance that economic forces, the way they drive us in, there seems to be some inadequacies in the guidance, whether that be regulatory or legal, or the framework that the economic environment engine works within. And on that similar note, carbon pricing and the energy transition. What are your thoughts, and how do you see energy transition being accelerated?
Well, the energy transition. The really good news is that it's in place. It cannot be stopped. I've talked to a lot of people and said, if you were an evil genius and you wanted to stop the energy transition, how would you do it? And no one has offered anything meaningful, because the truth is that solar and wind, clean energy, is now a fraction of the cost of fossil fuel. And the transition is going to take a few decades, because you have to, if you think about it, all of our energy use is done in capital equipment like a car or a truck, a furnace, a factory. And so to transition from fossil fuel to clean energy requires investing in capital equipment, and that takes a decade or two. And that's just, it's going to take a decade or two. The dyers are tossed. It ain't going no other way. We can make it go a little bit faster simply by putting incentives on the investment. I think there's a myth that if you increase oil prices, gas prices, that will use less natural gas. And that's true for a little bit. But the truth is that we all need to get to work, or at least we believe we need to. We all need to heat our houses. We believe we need to. Everyone agrees we need to. And so no matter what the price is, we're going to keep doing it until we buy an electric car, buy an electric heat pump, and so on. And so the people who really want to accelerate the transition, I really recommend they change their focus to investment, because that's where it all happens. It's this simple. The math is unbelievably simple, that globally we use 20,000 gigawatts of power. 80% of that is fossil fuel. And so we need to build 20,000 gigawatts of clean generation, which would be wind and solar, and possibly, some of the new fusion, nuclear, who knows what. But wind and solar, we know they work. We know they cost $1.50 a watt, which means that to invest in manufacture and invest in the 20,000 gigawatts, we need $30 trillion. That's it. And we know we have the technology. We have we were promised by at Glasgow $130 trillion of investment. So the money is there, ready to be utilized. And we just have to open the pipe wider to accelerate the investment rate. And that could be done once people stop making the oil companies wrong. I hear quite frequently, and I'm sure you hear, people say, oh, it's the oil companies are the evil ones. And, that's fine. You can pick your enemy as far as I'm concerned. But, if you put out Exxon and Chevron out of business, that's fine. And we'll fill our cars from Saudi Aramco. Not a big deal. Well, because we have to go to work. It makes much more sense to let the dealers go, because they're just selling you what you demand, and focus on the energy source. Because my friends in the oil business, they tell me, listen, we're in business to make money for our shareholders. That's our commission. That's what our charter is. And our shareholders don't care what we sell. We're just as happy to sell wind and solar as we are fossil fuels. Just at the moment, the system is designed for us to sell fossil fuel. So just increase the investment in wind and solar, and we can switch over in 10 years. And I predict that we will.
Yeah, I think for incentivizing extraction, if we need to go into negative emissions and go into carbon removal, do you believe that carbon pricing can play a part in incentivizing extraction or incentivizing some of the negative emissions that we'll need to see?
I've been writing on that the last week or two, and the sad answer is no. That all of the business model, and it surprised me because I helped start a direct air capture company. So I've been a big believer in direct air capture and a lot of other methods. When you get down to solving the whole problem, you realize that you have to pay for it. That is, if you want any manufacturing to happen, someone's got to pay the bill. And the problem with, say, direct air capture is, and then burying the CO2 underground, is that it's paid for by carbon offsets. And carbon offsets are essentially a tax on fossil fuel usage by big users. So power plants, oil refineries, those are the biggest buyers of carbon offsets, because it allows them to reduce their costs. But once we switch over in 10 or 15 years to renewable energy, that source of revenue goes away. And all we've done, the small amount of carbon removal that those carbon offsets pay for, just have almost no impact. You could say it slows down the rise. It certainly does not lower it. And then once you've gotten to zero emissions, there's no revenue to get CO2 down. And so you have to, as far as I can tell, you've got to provide a revenue source. And I think that's standard economics, that you can't run a business without revenue. I'm sure you've run businesses, you know that. It's maybe not so well known in the environmental circles, but for us in business, you've got to have revenue. And then the revenue source traditionally, when you're modifying the atmosphere, it's been energy companies that sell fossil fuel to people who pay a lot of money for energy. And it has a side effect of putting CO2 up. And then there are a couple businesses that are similar, where, like with synthetic limestone, they make synthetic limestone, which is by weight half CO2. Cubic yard of synthetic limestone concrete sequesters a ton. A cubic yard sequesters a ton of CO2. They sell you that synthetic limestone and has a byproduct of removing CO2. And they don't, the business model doesn't even require anyone to pay them for removing the CO2. They're just making a product that has a byproduct of removing CO2. And the ocean restoration is the other business model, which has exactly the same thing. They restore fisheries by growing more phytoplankton, which is the vegetable of the plants of the ocean. That's food for the fish. The fish expand. When you feed fish, they tend to grow. I think that's well understood, and that gives you more robust fisheries. It's profitable, and as a byproduct, they remove hundreds of, as far as we know, they remove hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 as a byproduct. So the point is that there's this. All of the news, I get dozens of news items a day cheering on these carbon removal projects, which are all based on carbon offsets. And I really am sorry that that's a good way to extend the life of fossil fuel, which probably is not what these people want, but I'm not going to guess what they want. But the impact is it extends the use of fossil fuel because it reduces its cost, but it can't possibly restore the climate.
So on that point, perhaps now is a good time just to give us a summation of a summation of some of the methods. So in your books, you've spoken about, as you said, methane, oxidation, synthetic limestone, seaweed growth, and iron, iron seeding in the oceans. Yeah. So I wondered whether it was now a good time just to maybe summarize or tell the audience how some of those work.
Yeah. So we call them the big four, and I do it in order of immediacy. So the most immediate one is the iron fertilization in the ocean, which it does the same thing nature does before ice ages. We've had 10 ice ages over the last million years, and if you look at the CO2 level on the historical graphs of the last million years, that they measure the CO2 from ice cores taken in Antarctica, and before the ice age, each ice age, nature removes roughly a trillion tons of CO2, and they sequester it in the ocean as just biocarbon in the ocean, and nature sequesters it with plants in the ocean, algae, phytoplankton. And it's powered by sunlight, and it's pretty obviously. So think of it in the ocean. You have lots of water, lots of sunlight, and you actually have a lot of nutrients. But there's one missing nutrient. And when I think of the ocean, I think of Hawaii, which is nice and blue. But blue is not green. Green is where you have photosynthesis. And how do you turn blue ocean green? In most of the blue ocean, it's minute amounts of iron dust. This is how minute. Take a square meter, about 1/100th of a teaspoon of iron dust, very fine, will turn that meter green for months and maybe a year. And if you ever sweep off your front porch, you know that 1/100th of a teaspoon of dust is vastly less than you get just on a normal day. So on land. And when that happens, you get the phytoplankton growing, you get fish growing. So that's number one. It's done in eddies, so it's contained. So you get this green eddy in a blue ocean for half a year or so, and the fish come, they fatten up, they attract birds and whales. The people who've done it tell me it's just amazing, the wildlife that shows up in those 100-mile diameter regions. So that's the first one. That, since it's what nature does before ice ages, it's totally my favorite. That nature has figured out how to deal with the change in ecosystems when that happens.
Now, how do the numbers, just some basic numbers, what would be required and over what period?
Yeah. So each of those costs, when they did a fairly good scale test 10 years ago, it cost about $1 million in operations and about $2 million in science. So if you call it $2 million total, because prices go up, then you need about 500 of those. They call them pastures because the ocean goes from blue to a beautiful green. They say it even smells like new mown hay. I haven't been there, but many people have told me that. And 500 of those. So 500 times $2 million is $1 billion required of investment. The great news is by the second time you've done it, you're now getting revenue available from the fisheries. So primarily public-private partnerships with the coastal nation. They say, okay, we'll give you 1% of our extra fish taxes or fishing licenses, and then you can use that to do the fertilization at the proper place in the proper time. As you can imagine, doing it in the wrong place in the wrong time is a waste of money. No one's going to do it. Anyway, so yeah, so that $2 billion in total investment will get that whole industry running, as far as we can tell. And there's no, science has shown that you can make it not work in lots of ways. Just like if you have a car, like I have, in our youth, we found 1,000 ways for the car to not work. But it doesn't mean the cars don't work. It just means that you have to run the car correctly in order for the engine to run and the brakes to work, and so on. So there's no evidence that it can't be done. It's just that it has to continually be refined. When they tested it 10 years ago, their measurements said that they had removed 100 million tons of CO2. Just amazing. So that's the first one. And what's interesting is there's a myth that there are no silver bullets. Well, that's only true if you say that's true. Nature has two. Nature has the iron fertilization in the ocean, which is how it produces ice ages, and nature has limestone. And so I'll talk about that. Limestone holds 99.9% of all the carbon on our planet. And if you think of the White Cliffs of Dover, the 100-meter cliffs of white limestone, that's an example of the bottom of the ocean, where you have hundreds of millions of years of skeletons of fish and whatever, shells and skeletons accumulated holding that limestone. And limestone by weight is almost half CO2. Well, as I mentioned, there's a company here in Silicon Valley that automates, that mechanizes what an oyster does. And I think of an oyster on my dinner plate sometimes at a restaurant, and that little tiny oyster makes this big chunk of rock over a year or two. Automating that turns out to be both difficult and easy. It's taken quite a few years to master the chemistry of it, but the process itself fits on one page easily. It's amazingly simple on paper. And so that we used a lot of rock for our concrete in our roads and buildings. So if you sum it all up, we use 7 tons per year per person on the planet, which amazed me, because I don't use that much of anything. But we build a lot of roads and a lot of buildings, and then we tear them down and we build new ones. And so if we replace the quarried rock with a synthetic limestone, we could sequester all trillion tons of excess CO2 by 2050 and be back below 300 parts per million with that CO2 sequestered under our feet in our roads and buildings. So that's the second one. Very exciting. It's profitable, again, because you're replacing quarried rock and all the shipping. Here in Northern California, most of our rock comes from British Columbia, in Canada and Mexico, because it's hard to get good quarries here. And so you can imagine there's a lot of money and fossil fuel saved by producing the rock locally. Yeah. The third one is a variation on the ocean fertilization. It's seaweed, because again, you're growing plants in the ocean. And when you grow plants on land, we all love growing trees. And there's I call it a myth that you can deal with climate by growing trees. I think everyone knows that trees die after a few decades, and then they rot or they burn, and the carbon goes back into the air. And so it's a very temporary thing. And if you plant trees, you're changing the ecosystem. Then now you have to deal with the landowners and so on. And you might even cause a disaster by disrupting nature that way. In the ocean, it's totally different. In the ocean, the plants die and they sink, or they get eaten by fish and everything sinks, the skeletons and the feces. And that's true of seaweed. So seaweed's a variation. The last one of the four is methane. And I got into the methane because I was very excited about 3 or 4 years ago, because we had identified those 3 pathways that any one of them could get us below 300, could actually save our skins by getting us to levels that humans have survived long term. And I thought, my God, let's get to work. And then I remembered my nightmare from about 10 or 15 years ago about a methane burst from the Arctic, because many of us, if you're like me, you've heard the story and you silence it. Say, I don't want to know about it because I can't do anything about it. That the last time our planet lost the Arctic ice cover over the Arctic Ocean was about 50 million years ago. We had some million years of ice cover there. It disappeared because the planet warmed up. It melted, and the undersea ice melted and released a burst of methane and other CO2. But that rapid warming from the rapid burst of methane killed a third of the species. Now, whether we would be one of that third or not, I don't want to find out. That's not something I want to give our children. It turned, and it seemed hopeless, because what can you do? And because we've lost 95% of our Arctic ice now. And so we've essentially gotten back to that point as 50 million years ago. The continents have shifted a little bit. And so, who knows whether it'll be a massive burst. The burst is starting, and we can deal with it by oxidizing it, which is what nature does. So you may know about methane. It's 100 times more stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. The advantage it has is that it oxidizes. Methane is the natural gas you have in your range, or if you have a gas range, like I do. And it burns. It's hard to get it on fire, and that's the thing. If you ever tried to light your oven on fire, the stove, and us older people have that experience. The technology is good now, and young people don't know how hard it is to light a range. So getting it to oxidize is hard, but nature does it, and there's a half-life of about 8 years. And we discovered that if you double the oxidation rate, it becomes a 4-year half-life, and the methane level goes down by half, and you actually get the global warming back to what it was 15 or 20 years ago, back to the turn of the century, before the wildfires, before the loss of reefs. And so And the way you do it is, again, with chemicals in the air. Most of the natural methane oxidation is with an OH or a hydroxyl radical, whatever that is. I mean, you and I know what it is, but some of your listeners don't, and don't worry about it. And the other part is with chlorine radicals. And think of chlorine bleach, it oxidizes things. It'll, oxidize the colors off of your nice shirt. And it'll also oxidize methane that has enough energy to do that. And so iron chloride is a chemical which is used in water purification plants. And if you aerosolize it in phenomenally small particles, the sunlight will knock one of the chlorines off the iron chloride. And that chlorine is now like chlorine bleach. It'll oxidize a methane molecule if it hits it. And then the iron will pull the chlorine back in, and it's catalytic. It lasts for a couple of weeks typically. And so the plan is obviously to continue testing, but we've had environmental analysis done, and they say there's no foreseeable downside to it. It doesn't mean there isn't a downside, it just means that there's nothing that we foresee, and the testing will continue. But it's natural, nature does it in small quantities. And so the plan is to evaporate the iron chloride in ship exhaust. And so then you have the ocean, which often has rain, but a lot of areas of the ocean have almost no rain, because rain will drive the iron chloride back out. But that's basically how it works. And the cost is about $1 billion a year. And that's primarily to manufacture the iron chloride. It's easy to manufacture, but it's about 500,000 or 1 million tons a year required.
And that's kept as an insurance policy. So that's really kind of a stockpile basically for emergency use.
Yes and no. If we do it we definitely want to do it continually, so that if the methane burst gets bad, we can respond within a year, right? Because we can, as humanity, can survive 1, maybe 2 bad harvests. When we've had huge volcanoes in the past, we've had the what they call it, the year without a summer. I forget when that was, but we've survived those things. But we have to respond fast. But to do that, we have to be operating it continually, so that we can just gear it up rather than start from scratch. The good news is that if by doing it, we're actually cooling the planet down. And so this is likely to be paid for by insurance companies, because since 2000, insurance companies have been paying out for climate-related damage, huge hurricanes and floods. They've been paying out, it went from $40 billion a year around the turn of the century to about $80 billion a year now. So they could save maybe $40 billion a year by simply investing $1 billion into cooling the planet down with the methane oxidation. So I think we'll actually do it. Obviously, it'll save a lot of lives. It'll make life much more comfortable for people. And I say that lightly, just because, as we said in the beginning, these things have to have revenue. If you don't have a source of revenue, if you don't have a company or a person with a lot of money, it ain't going to happen. And so the insurance companies clearly have that kind of revenue available to fund the iron chloride methane oxidation.
On that, I mean, that leads to a kind of an interesting question on the drivers. Who's going to try and coordinate to make this happen? And in your book, you've touched on the UN and on some of the organizations that you would see as being key participants in this. I have a kind of a controversial opener, which is, do you think the UN is fit for purpose?
Well, yes, but not for this purpose. The UN is doing what it does extremely well. And I don't know if you've been to any of the UN climate conferences, but on the one hand, people are very frustrated. On the other hand, you meet dozens and dozens of key people you would never have met if they hadn't organized this conference, where everyone's rolling their eyes most of the time. And so they're phenomenally effective in getting the right people together at the right time. We pretend, we think unconsciously that the UN should be like Congress or Parliament and make laws, but for the most part they don't. And they do make some, the law of the sea, the whole maritime system, international telecommunications, all of that is originated in the UN. But for climate, no. The problem is the UN is United Nations, and nations are primarily economic entities. Adam Smith wrote about the wealth of nations. That's the fundamental aspect. And so the UN negotiations are all about money. You wouldn't think so, but listen again next time you go. And it's all about carbon offsets and how do you price them, who has to pay and who benefits and who gets the subsidies. It's all about money. And that's why the UN has been talking about 2 degrees warming, which is the original idea of maximizing GDP growth, 1.5, which is like, well, actually climate is worse. We need to have it more ambitious in order to maintain economic growth. Those of us who have kids, and I have 3 new grandkids in the last year and a half, we're concerned about a lot more than just economics. We want a planet, but the UN is not. There's nothing in the UN Charter saying that we're accountable to future generations, that they have a livable planet. That could be modified, but probably not in time to do it. So the question you're asking is, if not the UN, and I'm American, the US government pretty clearly is not set up to do it. It's, again, fantastic work being done by the National Oceanographic, NOAA, I can't remember their national, what you call the Met Office in Europe. They're doing phenomenal work. The Environmental Protection Agency is doing phenomenal work. But overall, again, the goal is, it's a national goal of economic growth. And there's no one there calling for taking care of future generations, right? Because it's pretty clear, and any nation, I think, I certainly know the US, is accountable, the government is accountable to their stakeholders, to taxpayers, to voters and donors. And my grandchildren, being 1.5 and half a year old, they don't do any of those. And so there's no accountability of the government to them. And so the government is accountable to my neighbors, some of whom need jobs, and this definitely need better roads and so on. So it's not the government. It's not the UN, it's not the government. And then you might be throwing your hands up like, oh my God, is it just me? And most of us don't have that kind of money. But there are what we call family offices, or you could say sovereign funds. So if you think of a friend of mine is friends with Prince Albert of Monaco. And I don't know him, I don't know anything about his situation, but conceptually, as a family, part of the royal family with resources, their goal is to maintain a good environment for their children. And they're smart enough to know their children depend on all of our children. And so family, and those are called family offices. Technically, any family with wealth above $50 million is sort of considered to have a family office to manage the investment in philanthropy. And those offices are designed to provide a healthy environment for future generations. And so those are the entities that are structured to pay for these things. And that's where we're looking. Just again, you play the cards you're dealt, and those cards are the face on those cards is the face of being accountable to future generations.
Yeah, I think that's very, very succinctly put. Population, do you think that overpopulation is the elephant in the room?
Oh, of course. I think you could ask anyone on the street, and if you give the right amount of coffee or beer, they would, to relax, they would agree. The global population is 10 times higher than that stable level that nature figured out, so to speak, over the last 10,000 years while we developed agriculture. Now you might ask, why didn't we develop agriculture before, because we had an unusually long, stable period, stable climate at this warm period before the next ice age. And of course, we canceled out the ice age with our CO2 emissions. But if you think about it, any region where the culture said, oh, we're going to have a larger population, if that population was too high, then a nearby tribe would come and demolish them because the population was too high and they weakened their ecosystem. And yet this takes 100 years. And that's why, it's taken us about 200 years to demolish our ecosystem. And if we kept on our path, then of course it'll be the cockroaches who take over from us, metaphorically. And so it's interesting that I call it a safe harbor level. And so when a ship is in stormy seas, the captain goes to a safe harbor, a place that he or she has actually been before safely. And if a ship's mate says, hey, I know this island, which is close and it's beautiful, I think it's safe, the captain will say, great, I'm going to the safe harbor where I've been. No risks taken, because it's the whole ship. And in climate, that's the 280 parts per million CO2 that we had for 10,000 years. In population, it's that population we had that was stable for 10,000 years. That was actually doubling every 1,000 years. And so it doubled, 5 or 10 times. But that's 10 times lower. The maximum of that was 10 times lower before we broke the system. And we, with good intentions, but a little bit of blindness, as you said earlier, that the nature keeps any species in balance with its local ecosystem with what we call child survival rate. That is the number of acorns that grow into oak trees. That rate depends on the local conditions. The number of salmon fry that grow into full-grown salmon depends on the local resources. With humans, it's the same, that we would have 3 children out of which one would survive to adulthood on average over a 50 or 100 year average. And as parents, we don't like that. And when we had the technology of the Industrial Revolution, we tripled that. So instead of the survival rate being 30%, it's now 95%. And so, of course, you get a population explosion until you weaken the ecosystem to the point that things collapse, which is what we're seeing now. Now, so that's the bad news. The bad news is listen to Mother Nature. She figured out what was sustainable. And the good news is getting back to that safe harbor population is amazingly easy. People always ask me if I don't tell them first. They say, Peter, how are you going to cull the herd? Because we're at 8 billion now. And the safe harbor is basically 2 billion. And I could talk about why that is, but just take it for granted at the moment. And people have worried, like, how do you go down that much? That sounds horrible. Well, the good news is it'll take the end of the century, maybe 100 years to get there. And in 100 years, everyone alive now will have died natural deaths. And so we don't have to worry about the death rate. We have to worry about the number of people 100 years from now is purely a function of the number of births. And that's easy to control. A friend of mine likes to say, make love, not babies. If you ever had kids, you know that that's really true. If you want to make love, you don't want a baby in the house. And so we know how to do that. And the good news, here's another part of the good news, is the birth rate that'll take us back to the safe harbor population by the end of the century is the birth rate that we already have in Italy. I think you said you're in Italy now. And it's a beautiful place. People are not stressed. It's 1.3 children per woman. And I tell people, young people, I said, in the United States, it costs $1 million per child. So if you're going to have a second child, that's $1 million. That's not going into your retirement account. Think about it. Do you want money in your retirement account? Or do you want to threaten our ecosystems with another child? and just let them decide. And then, then the final part of the good news, it's easy to convince people, is my point. If you force them, it doesn't work. China had a one-child policy, and if you look at the birth rate over time in China, it went from about 6 down to 2.4, and then they instituted the one-child policy. It went back up because people rebelled against the one-child policy, so they had more children, and then it went down along with all the neighboring countries. Then they got rid of the one-child policy about 5 years ago, and there was a little burst because there were a few million women who said, "Oh, thank God I can have a child now, the second child," and then it plummeted, and it's now. The point is that using force is almost always counterproductive, and so just use young people's wisdom. Here's the cool thing: it's 15% of the population we have to empower. It's women from 15 years old to 40, the childbearing age, that we have to empower, and really empower, because they control the future of humanity. If those 15% of humanity, if they got angry and they said, "You know what? No more kids. We're done with this," that's the end of humanity. There would be no kids. Just those young women control our future, and we can empower them to really be accountable for future generations. Tell them, we are going to a sustainable population, do the right thing. And by the way, on average, that's the birth rate of Italy. So that's the good news.
Okay, that's a positive way to come to my final questions. So just a few closing questions, if I may. On a solemn note, how do we explain what may be coming to our children?
Well, that's a great question. It's not so solemn because when you're heading for a cliff, slowing down isn't good enough. You got to turn. And so we're actually turning. And the way you buck the system, right? Because the system is heading for the cliff, which is the solemn thing I think you're referring to. But we can turn it. And the way you turn is you commit. In a ship, the captain usually talks to his first mate and the navigator says, "Okay, we're going to turn," and together they turn the ship. And so as parents, what we tell our children is, we are restoring the climate. Now together we'll work out the details of how to do it successfully. I've given you the outline, and so it's really easy. You just commit to something that you're committed to, and that you would give your life to, and of course, I think we all would, and then we do it. What I point to in the book is that we have the technologies to do it. For sure, some of these technologies are not going to pan out, or will be more difficult, if for nothing else, for political reasons. But that's okay. There are enough backups that we can and will do it. So promise your kids that I am accountable for restoring the climate. My generation is accountable for that. Hold us to account, and we'll do it.
Thank you. And just two quick questions at the end. Humans, a plague that will pass, or are we potentially planet destroyers?
What's very cool is we have enough knowledge, which we pass down, that we can stay here for forever. And because if an asteroid comes, we can find it and blow it up. So we likely have 1 million years, maybe even 1 billion years left on the planet, because we actually understand the ecosystems. The trick is, I call this period of time the bar mitzvah for humanity. And when you're a child, you burn down the garage accidentally. I can see your face. You've done stuff like, I haven't done that, but I've done pretty close. I can see your face. You probably have too, right? And the adults take care of it. You burn the carpets, burn floors, all that stuff. And that's how we've treated the world. And our brains develop as young kids. So we develop as young kids, and it takes the force of the community. And I'm Jewish, so I had a bar mitzvah. And you go through the ceremony and you learn all the prayers and you talk in front of the congregation and so on. but it opens the door to being an adult and being responsible. And so this period we're in right now is the bar mitzvah for humanity, where humanity, rather than trying to predict where we're going, we're actually being responsible for it. And we're telling our kids, we are restoring the climate. We are restoring a sustainable population. And so we can be here forever because we have the technology now to keep us going.
Yeah, I agree. I think it seems as though we've developed the muscles and strength of an adolescent, but not the wiseness yet. And
that's the bar mitzvah.
Yeah, at the moment we're crashing around, breaking things, and it's just a question of whether we wise up in time. I think that's a very nice phrase. Your phrase is the bar mitzvah, the adolescent period. I think the analogy is very, very similar, and it's, we've developed these powers and strengths, and we don't know what to do with them, and we're doing those damage in the meantime, and it's whether we wisen up and become enlightened and find those sustainable pathways, which we're so keen to find.
Well, the access to that transformation is, you don't make being a child wrong, right? You and I were wild boys. I can see it in your face, and we don't make ourselves wrong. That's what wild boys do, the things that we did, and then we grew up.
Yep.
And so for humanity, we were wild kids in humanity as long as we could. And now there's the Pottery Barn rule, which says if you break it, you own it. Well, own it means being adult and being responsible. And so then, I invite you and your listeners to join me in saying, okay, bar mitzvah is over. Now we're adults and we are responsible. And we will make sure that humanity joins us in being responsible. We just have to own up that we have been kids, as we should have been, and we're now adults.
On that note, thank you very much, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a real joy, and we'd like to get behind climate restoration as a topic. It's something we also support, in terms of the inevitability of the realization that actually we do need to go back to 300 because of the other environmental consequences that would come from maintaining a level at 450 or 420 or even worse. Are actually not palatable. So we're behind this in terms of the realization, I think, that not just stabilizing CO2 is not as sufficient. Actually, we need to go into negative territory and as rapidly as possible. So we'd like, if you had an op-ed, we'd always be very welcome to publish an op-ed from you. And it's something we invite every book review author that we interview. So that's something we could do. But generally speaking, we're here as an organization. I think we share quite a lot of the same spirit, and
yes,
it would be very good to keep this conversation going. And we'll track what you're doing. At the moment, we're using it's kind of the power of communication to try and further the message. And then over time, we have big ambitions for what Earth.org can become in terms of a platform and a force for good in this world. So I think it's been great to meet you on this occasion, and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for your commitment that has Earth.org move forward. I love it.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thanks very much indeed.